You're very welcome, Hyatt. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to Martha for inviting me, and for all of you for daring to raise the question of militarism in the midst of one of the most heavily propagandized moments in our history, I think. I'm honored as well to be on the same panel with Phyllis Bennis, whose piece in These Times I read the day after the Russian invasion. And I was so moved by her sanity in the midst of all of the war fever that still grips so much of the punditocracy, at least. Whether it grips the population as a whole is another question. I was so moved that I did something I rarely do, and that is I actually went on to my Twitter account and tweeted it. I try to avoid social media as much as possible, but I couldn't resist in this case. My millions of followers, I'm sure, appreciated that. But thank you, Phyllis, for that, and for your voice since then, which I've been paying attention to every chance I get. I want to take a brief minute to indulge myself in telling my own story here, which is a story of an ancient mariner. In 1969 and 1970, I was a Navy cryptographer with a top secret clearance on a ship that carried nuclear weapons, which the Navy denied, by the way. My job, among others, was to decrypt the message that would have launched those non-existent weapons. And this caused me to think quite hard about my role in the military. I had been opposed to the Vietnam War when I was in college, but like other young men of my class and conservative cultural background, I could imagine no real alternative to military service. So I did what a lot of other young men did, which was to join Naval ROTC in college. And I ended up, due to my assignment, finding myself in the same ethical dilemma, at least potentially, that I would have faced on the ground in Vietnam. In fact, there was no way I could do my job in the Navy without killing civilians. That's the nature of nuclear weapons, despite all the talk then and more recently of the surgical precision with which so many of them can be allegedly outfitted. So there I was, tossing on my bunk, even considering deserting to Canada. Fortunately, through a friend, I discovered a group called Pacific Coast Military Counseling, and I learned I could apply for conscientious objector discharge if I could show that my beliefs had changed after going on active duty. And this, in fact, I could do. My assignment crystallized my doubts into anti-war convictions, not just about the Vietnam War, but about all modern wars, all of which kill civilians systematically and unavoidably. To make a long story short, I was honorably discharged as a conscientious objector. Now, my lessons for contemporary affairs in this story are three. The first of them is the role of class in the military, as everywhere else in our society, because a young man, a very young man, even younger than I was, named Jacobs from Kansas. I only knew him as RM2 Jacobs. He applied for, he was in my department, the communications department on this US Navy cruiser. His name was Jacobs, as I say. And he was a 19-year-old kid without a whole lot of education. He applied for conscientious objector discharge at the same time I did, and he was thwarted at every step of the way. I was an officer, and he was the lowest of the low enlisted recruits, and he was baited, he was harassed, his requests were ignored, and ultimately he deserted, and eventually was picked up by the FBI in Canada. He was as sincere, every bit as sincere as I was, and as every bit as deserving of an honorable discharge. But he came nowhere near receiving it because of the place that he came from in our society. and the place he occupied in the military bureaucratic hierarchy. So that's one lesson. The second is the importance of remembering the source of the disinformation in the story. And this, bear in mind, is over 50 years ago, so this is not new. It's been going on for a long time, right down to the present. The source was the military itself, along with the national security state. And we have to remember when we talk about the problem of disinformation in this society, which pervades a lot of the punditocracy, even as we speak, the source of disinformation, the original and professional source, is the national security state. And it still is, even at this time when we now have retired CIA directors posing as professional wise men on allegedly liberal news media channels. This is a scandal. This is a scandal that these people who have perjured themselves before Congress should be accorded this role. But that's the society we live in, and I'm going to circle back around to that before I conclude. So that's the second point, is the source of disinformation. It's just not just a bunch of QAnon right-wing wackos. Admittedly, they're a menace and they're dangerous and we have to discredit them. But they're very easy to discredit by comparison to the national security state with all of its power and all of its legitimacy. And this is what we have to remember somehow as we go forward, is where the real source of disinformation lies, and the most powerful and moneyed source of disinformation. And finally, the third lesson from my experience that I want to bring up here now is the importance of a kind of common militarist mentality outside the military as well as inside it. And it involves a denatured language of objectivity. It involves a reduction of human beings to numbers. I remember reading Theodore Rozak's book, The Making of a Counterculture, about what he called the myth of the objective consciousness, while I was tossing on my bunk worrying about my role in causing, at least potentially, a nuclear war. So what I want to say here when I talk about this common militarist mentality, this is one reason I became a cultural historian, is I wanted to dissect this mentality and demonstrate its destructive capacities. But there are links between the local counterinsurgency conflicts in Vietnam, like the one I was cutting my intellectual teeth on, and you can pick your dozens of others ever since. Links between those local conflicts and the big picture of nuclear war and the nuclear arms race. They involve the same kind of mentality. They depend on the same kind of mentality, the distancing from human suffering and violence and pain. And so in the decades since my discharge from the Navy, I've been teaching and writing much of the time against the militarist foreign policy, or at least attempting to discover the historical roots of that foreign policy. And some of this agitation that I was involved in the Peace Studies program at the University of Missouri, which was my first teaching job out of graduate school. I was involved in the nuclear freeze movement. That seemed to be an apparent success, at least briefly, and for a moment it held out the prospect, the actual abolition of nuclear weapons, until Reagan realized he couldn't give up his Star Wars fantasy of creating the so-called nuclear shield, which was a boondoggle and a fantasy and still is. So the nuclear freeze movement never realized its full possibility, but what it did do was show the critical importance of citizen diplomacy outside the typical channels of official diplomacy, because what people tend to forget is that there was a huge anti-nuclear movement, a nuclear freeze movement in effect, in the Soviet Union too, and that was part of the background of Gorbachev's rise to power. More commonly, though, despite that moment of apparent victory, we in the peace movement faced endless frustration. The massive worldwide protest against the first Gulf War and the invasion of Iraq 12 years later had no impact ultimately on foreign policy, or even ultimately on the national conversation. The people who were dead wrong about those wars kept their legitimacy. The people who were spot on about those wars continued to be outsiders. Now, the general drift of policy since then has been toward bipartisan consensus in military intervention abroad. The collapse of the USSR, the end of the Cold War, the vision of a unipolar world is what that brought, with the US, of course, on top, not a peace dividend, which was briefly spoken of. Oh, well, the Cold War is over. We might actually have some money to address all of these urgent social matters, problems that people have been alluding to all along, and other speakers already, in our domestic policies. No, we couldn't do that. Instead, we had continued agitation for a permanent war economy, which was, again, a popular point of view in both political parties. And I think we know why, but we can unpack that at greater length. The Republicans, who started to call themselves neoconservatives, though there was nothing conservative about them, nothing they wanted to conserve, but they were for expansion of US power pretty much for its own sake, and the restoration of what they called a new American century. The Democrats had basically the same militarist, expansionist, imperial policies, but tarred up with universalist, humanitarian rhetoric about global leadership, about a rules-based international order, which always begged the question, i.e. ignored the question of who made rules. And this part of the consequences of this was the beginnings, even in the early 90s, of the expansion of NATO eastward, which did in fact create Russian security concerns, which George Kennan and other major figures in our diplomatic and political history warned against. And we are living with the consequences of ignoring those warnings right now in the midst of this war in Ukraine. So it's not surprising that the major renewed commitment to the modernization of our nuclear arsenal was made by Obama, not by the Republicans. Even though the Republicans supported it and Trump continued it, Obama was the initiator of it, and that was perfectly in keeping with the mood of the Democratic Party leadership since the Clinton era, basically, since the 1990s. So the consequence, the nuclear arms race was restarted again, reaccelerated. And since the rise of Trump in 2016, peace has virtually disappeared from the progressive agenda. It's been replaced by a focus on the rights of ethnic, racial, and sexual minorities, on the protection of immigrants, and on climate change. And believe me when I say to you, I think these are all worthy and quite urgent causes in their own right. But what most progressives, at least at the national level, don't seem to realize is that all of those causes, and my companions here have already been saying these things, all of these are threatened by our militarist foreign policy, whether it involves toppling foreign dictators without regard for the consequences, as in the case of Gaddafi and Libya, and the subsequent unleashing of mountains of weapons throughout North Africa and the Middle East, whether it's fighting a proxy war against Russia to the last Ukrainian, or most important, whether it's restarting the nuclear arms race and enlarging an already bloated, hugely bloated military budget. Now, the recent history of progressive foreign policy, I have to say, is a history of failure and silence. The silence is particularly striking among traditional peace groups. And here I exempt, by the way, one of which I'm a member, and I know there are other members here present, Veterans for Peace. This is not an indictment against that group, but against, for example, I can think of many others, but let me just give you the most egregious example, the American Friends Service Committee, which was hugely helpful to me when I was in the Navy and to many other military conscious objectors back in the late 60s and early 70s. Now you can go to the AFSC website and see lots of attention paid to mass incarceration, to immigration policy, to a whole range, to climate change even, but nothing, not a word about the urgency of a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. So this is simply astounding to me. So the silence of peace groups is part of the problem, but the failure is also quite egregious in many cases. Political leaders, Bernie Sanders being a prime example, with his kind of alarming swerve toward support for a militarist and imperialist foreign policy, which he seems to think is still consistent with a progressive domestic policy. The point of this gathering, as I read it, and it's certainly my point too, is that it's not consistent with a progressive domestic policy. But Progressive Caucus, so-called, failed utterly to stand by a tepid call for diplomacy, that 30 progressives signed. They backed away immediately when the howls of the punditocracy and the Democratic leadership began to be heard. So what is to be done? Everybody's favorite question, right? Easier posed than answered. But the quick answer, and here I'm just reasserting what Phyllis said, I think quite eloquently, is link domestic and foreign policy, hammer away at the destructive impact of militarism. And I'm going to give 4 different examples and then I'll stop. The first destructive impact of militarism is obvious, but again, largely unmentioned these days. And that's draining money away, huge amounts of it, from resources that are desperately needed by marginalized outgroups, and indeed for all Americans. Medicare for all, for example, is constantly being met by the observation or the riposte. We can't afford it. Right? We can afford 800 billion, 850 billion, I forget, I'm not current, 850 billion for the military policy, and Lord knows how much else in consulting fees for all those people in Northern Virginia. This is affordable, but Medicare for all is not. So this is a problem we're facing. Every time I take the train through Baltimore between Washington and New York, I'm reminded of the schools in Baltimore and cities like it. No heat, no books. This is a disgrace. This is an absolute disgrace. I know those schools. I taught in one once. This is an old argument, but one which has somehow been forgotten. So I'm saying to all of you and to everyone who's out there actively involved, you can't bring it up enough. It's so important. This imperial foreign policy makes a lot of people very rich, but it also makes even more people very poor, many more people. Okay, that's number one. The second is the continuing catastrophes that we're creating abroad through our imperial overreach are also creating refugee populations en route to our own shores, as well as many elsewhere in Europe. And they create hardships for those who stay behind. Think of the Middle East after the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. Think of North Africa after the overthrow of Gaddafi. Think of Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba under the impact of economic sanctions. And remember, please, that economic sanctions are a form of violence too. And in fact, they led directly to the rise of Nazism in the early 1920s in Germany. People are starving. When people are starving, they don't think straight, and they listen to voices in the air, authoritarian voices, many of them, and they're very seductive sounding because they want answers. They want relief to their suffering. So that's the second thing. There is a connection between immigration and refugee crises, obviously, between those crises and our foreign policy. The third thing, third of four, and it's getting even more important now, the impossibility of addressing climate change without real international cooperation. Jeffrey Sachs talks about this all the time. He's one of the only people I know who's saying, look, you wanted to address climate change, you got to reorient your foreign policy. You cannot see climate change as addressing climate change as anything but a hopeless prospect. It will always be a hopeless prospect in a world that is divided into hostile armed camps. And this is the world that the US is playing a major role in creating, even as we speak right now. This is not a world that is ever going to come to grips with climate change. Finally, number 4, the impossibility of life itself after the ultimate climate change caused by nuclear war, which again, the US confrontations with Russia and China are already helping to make more likely, as well as, of course, the abandonment of all of those nuclear arms treaties and in the beginning in the Bush administration and continuing through the Obama and Trump administrations right down to the present. I'm reminded here again, and this is a cultural historian in me trying to pay attention to what is out there in terms of public media, public offerings. The New York City Public Service ad, which some of you may have undoubtedly seen on Twitter or elsewhere, that deploys all the old cliches about the impact of a nuclear explosion on New York City. Get yourself inside. Don't try to run away in your car. Don't try to hide. Get yourself inside. Close the windows. Get away from the windows. And oh, by the way, if you've been exposed to radiation, take a shower. This is what we used to be told in the Navy. This is what the civil defense fantasies that Robert Scheer satirized decades ago, saying, with enough shovels, we can win this thing. We can outlast this thing. Nuclear weapons are not weapons like any other. They cannot be used, period. And we have got to revive that belief and that insight. We have forgotten so much in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And we can't begin to work for peace until we start remembering again. I'm reminded of the great novelist Milan Kundera's famous statement, and I'll revise it slightly. The struggle of people against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And we have got to do some serious remembering here. Thank you all for listening.